So our workshop includes Dr. Karen Jensen, who is a teaching assistant professor in bioengineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Andrew Danowitz, who is an associate professor of computer and electrical engineering at Cal Poly, well, I suppose I can say the whole thing. California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. Dr. Sarah Wilson is a lecturer in the Department of Chemical and Materials Engineering at the University of Kentucky. Melanie Miller is a PhD student in counseling psychology at the University of Kentucky. And Courtney Wright is also a PhD student in counseling psychology at the University of Kentucky. So I guess take it away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our workshop. We're excited that you can make it. And today we'll be talking about promoting mental health and wellness in undergraduate educators. We'll be throughout this workshop. First, we're going to walk you through the state of research in engineering student mental health, both pre-COVID and in light of the ongoing COVID epidemic. And we'll then talk about some ways to support our students and also take a look at some student help-seeking behavior. Finally, we'll have a discussion of how best to support student mental health in your courses.
All right, so in getting started, I just want to give an introduction to kind of the current state of research in engineering student mental health. Before we go into the specifics of engineering students, just to talk a little bit about mental health on college campuses as a whole. So over the past 10 or 20 years, we've seen an increase in mental health concerns kind of across the board at universities. So depression has increased from about 24.8% of students in 2009 up to almost 30% of students in 2017. We've seen an increase in anxiety from 22% of students in 2014 to now 31% of students in 2019, and an increase in suicidal ideation from 5.8% of students in 2007 up to 10.8% of students in 2017. So along with that increase in mental health concerns, we've also seen an increase in the mental health service utilization. So in 2007, about 18.7% of students were utilizing on-campus mental health services, and that has increased up to about 34% of students in 2017. And the reason why we're concerned about mental health for our undergraduate students is that untreated or undertreated problems related to student mental health have been linked to dropout and poor academic performance. And also those students that are at highest risk for suicide are often the least likely to seek help. So it's really important for us as faculty and graduate students and working at a university to understand how we can support our students. When it comes to looking at mental health within the engineering student population, there have been a few studies that have looked at the frequency of different mental health disorders in the engineering student population. And really, overall, there's kind of a lot of variability in the frequency of mental health concerns at different universities. So Andrew, who's on our webinar right now, in 2018 found that students at California Polytechnic were roughly 2 times more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, or PTSD-like symptoms than the average college student population. So engineering students at California Polytechnic had a significant higher frequency of these mental health concerns. Additionally, 38% of the respondents in their survey were at risk for a serious mental illness. In 2019, some data that was found from the Healthy Mind study showed that engineers were actually less likely to report having symptoms associated with a mental health concern when compared to the general student population. So about 31% of engineering students were having concerns related to depression, as opposed to 37.4% of the general student population. About 25% of students within engineering reported symptoms associated with anxiety, compared to 31.4% of the general student population. 12.1% of engineers reported suicidal ideation versus 14.2% of the general student population. And about 1.7% of engineering students had a past suicide attempt, compared to 1.5% of the non-engineering student population. And Andrew's also going to talk about some additional data here, where in 2020, they did another survey of the engineering student population at 5 different institutions. And they found that about 29% of engineering students potentially suffered from a diagnosable mental health condition. And about 55% of those students that they screened for having moderate or higher levels of psychological distress. And one of the concerning things with that is they found that female respondents, especially those from historically excluded ethnic groups and races, showed elevated rates of PTSD and panic disorders. So obviously, the reason that you're here today is to learn about undergraduate student mental health and how we can support our students. So what we'd like for you to do right now is just share with us, what is your biggest concern about undergraduate student mental health? So you can do that either by unmuting yourself and sharing your thoughts with us, or by just typing it in the chat. And we'll use this information to kind of guide our talk as we go through the discussion today. So concerns related to stigma and students being afraid to ask for help, dismissiveness around mental health concerns, definitely influence of the pandemic on mental health concerns within our students is a big concern. And Andrew will be talking about that in a minute. Missing the student that's in distress. So Melanie is going to talk to us about for a bit about how we can identify students that are showing signs of distress. Okay, so as we go through our discussion today, we'll make sure to kind of bring these ideas and thoughts back up to the forefront as we're given time to discuss things. But we'll continue on to talk about some data related to the impact of the pandemic on COVID, on student mental health.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how COVID has affected student mental health. And one thing I should note, the data I'm presenting here was collected from about May to July 2020, when we were still relatively early in the pandemic, and most institutions were closed for that first semester, first quarter of the pandemic, and students were remote. From a mental health perspective, the biggest change we've seen in the data has been in depression screening rates. While most of the other things, PTSD, anxiety disorders, are in line with what we've previously observed in engineering students, as of May to July last year, roughly half of all of our respondents were screening positive for as being likely to have some sort of depressive disorder. Now, students also reported experiencing a number of stressful life events as a result of COVID. Now, fortunately, at least at the time, very few students reported the most serious life events and potential outcomes of COVID, such as death of a friend, family member, or romantic partner. But many students reported changes in a number of self-care related measures, including socialization, sleep habits, eating habits, and recreation. And these are the big ones that we're always recommending students engage in to try to shake off some of the stress of engineering, especially good sleep and exercise. So taken together, while only a modest number of students are likely to be facing the most severe consequences of COVID, and not to minimize these students, these are certainly students we need to look out for. But many students across the board are facing significant impacts to quality of life and ability to engage in self-care. It's also important to note that the COVID pandemic hasn't just affected people's health, it's also had a drastic impact on the economy and especially on students on the wrong side of the digital divide. I know some of you have probably heard the term K-shaped economic recovery, where people who were already doing well economically are now back to where they were or better, but people in the lower half are much worse off. And at least as of May to July last year, nearly 40% of respondents reported COVID-related issues in accessing either the instruction itself or instructional material. 36% of respondents reported food insecurity that was either caused by COVID or was made worse by the COVID-induced recession. And about 1 in 5 students reported housing insecurity that was either made worse by COVID or caused by COVID. Now, normally we would hope that our institutions would be able to jump in with things like financial aid, low-cost housing, campus-based food banks. But even for those colleges who are back to in-person already, who have access to their students, college resources are already stretched pretty thin. Across the nation, state schools are facing deficits as budgets have been slashed. So we can't necessarily count on our institutions to take care of students in the way that we might normally expect during a recession. Right. From here, we're going to be diving into a breakout room discussion, and we'll be looking at the questions: what are some stressors that are common to all students engineering? And what are some stressors that might only impact some of our students?
Hi, Jeff. Okay, cool. Okay. Hey, Chanel.
Hey, love, how are you?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm cool. I'm in two Zoom calls right now.
Actually at 3.
Hey, Alex.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How about you?
Good. I'm
That's
good.
All right, I think we are all back. So I'll go ahead and share my screen again. And we will continue. So our plan is to talk about kind of all these breakout room discussions. We'll come together at the end and have plenty of time to talk about it as a whole group. So we're not going to do a recap of what went on in each room yet.
Great. We've been talking about mental health challenges for students and also how COVID has added or exacerbated some of these stressors. So next just want to spend a few minutes in thinking about how we can create the best environments for our students that support student wellness. So I'd like to just start with this student quote talking about mental health, and to note this quote was prior to the COVID outbreak. So I'll just give you a moment to read this quote from the student. So the emphasis to this quote is mine. I bolded a few statements just to kind of highlight a few things of what the student was sharing with us and talking about being constantly overwhelmed with schoolwork and how this was a very common feeling. This idea that it was brought up earlier in the chat of people saying about engineering kind of having this culture of high rigor and high stress that students feel being in engineering programs. And this idea that the student feeling that there wasn't a lot of sympathy for students coming from instructors, and the suggestion that it would be great if instructors were reaching out to students and showing that they care about student well-being. So uh, this so one thing we want to consider as educators is, again, this was brought up in the chat earlier, of how can we as either are we contributing to those ideas from students about this high rigor, and how can we also dismantle this idea that high stress goes along with engineering programs, or that poor self-care, right? Pulling all-nighters. How do we set that tone with our student? So what are some ways that we can do that? So I'm drawing on a framework here, a conceptual framework by G and Berger for student thriving. And here we're going to share a few ideas of some practical approaches that faculty can take as far as to support student wellness. And some of these ideas are drawn from an earlier CDI discussion we had this summer in July that was specifically focused on wellness in online learning environments. So again, somebody added in the chat earlier about the engineering narrative, about like not being cut out for engineering and these different cultural norms. And Sarah also mentioned in her presentation about how engineering students are less likely to seek help, and how that might be related to what people perceive as norms or the culture in engineering. So in this framework, there's 4 different aspects of this framework of student thriving. The first is engineering culture, or the norms and expectations in engineering. So how can we emphasize wellness and self-care? So for example, a lot of the students at my institution, when they gave recommendations to faculty, shared that not having assignments due at midnight or first thing in the morning, that would, because that can promote students to stay up all night and pull all-nighters and work even longer on our assignments. And modeling self-care of ourselves. So things like not responding. I know a lot of, I'm definitely guilty of this sometimes, but responding to emails kind of all day through the night and all over the weekend, and normalizing this idea that we're always connected, or always need to be working and not taking a break ourselves. And how does that impact students? Um, in fact, some recent research in psychology suggests that this constant connectedness via smartphones and social media is both detrimental to students being able to focus on their work, as well as for their mental health. So again, how can we normalize that idea that constant connectedness is not required for success in engineering, and that people should be taking breaks? I know my own institution and many have had spring break canceled. Um, this semester, and instead have individual days off. So how can we structure our courses to make sure students are getting those breaks, and that is an expectation, right? That they do take a true day off as opposed to just a day without classes, that where they're catching up on assignments or studying for the next test. Another idea is syllabus statements. So a lot of institutions are starting to have mental health syllabus statements that you can include into your syllabus. So things, again, to help normalize the fact to students that it is okay to seek help, and here are the resources that you can use on our campus. So for interpersonal relationships with other people, so research shows that loneliness is problematic for student mental health, and of course this is likely exacerbated by the COVID restrictions during the pandemic. So thinking about how we can encourage both student-student and student-faculty interactions in our courses. You know, and these could be really small things that might not even change our course, like adding additional time or staying on the Zoom call after your class ends, and maybe students will stay on and chat a little bit about something not course related. I found a lot of times students are seem like they want to stay on the call and just talk, and providing them the space to do that, make connections, and talk to you and talk to other students in the class. And also, you know, this could be policies in our course, so encouraging them to work in teams both during class or outside of class on different assignments. For the interpersonal component or the relationship with oneself, some suggestions or ideas, these could be things like adding mindfulness activities during your class, or but maybe before an exam. This is something that I've done with my classes, that I've really enjoyed it personally, is any students who want to stay on the Zoom call, we listen to a 2 or 3 minute breathing exercise or mindfulness recording after class. And I also offer them before exams. So I allow students, there's a separate Zoom room that they can log into, and we play a mindfulness activity to help them focus and, you know, focus on their breath for a few minutes before they take the exam, and kind of just really set the tone. And that's been really well received by students. And of course, this can also tie back to the cultural piece, right, of encouraging students to focus on their own self-care. And then finally, so for the academic one, we discussed this a little bit earlier in the presentation, but this idea of that different students might have different stressors depending on their home situation or other things that they're experiencing, and how that's impacting their academics, both their success and their progress in your course. So just keeping in mind, again, that can be really different for different student groups. And one thing that I found really helpful to me is just to ask the students directly, what are stressors for them? This can be an anonymous survey, or you know, ask students to share. And that's been really helpful to me in identifying some of those stressors that I might not have realized for particular students given their situation, and then can adapt to them. Um, you know, and these could be things, you know, like rearranging your exam schedule just because, you know, 2 other classes have an exam that week, or there's a other big event like the career fair or something for students. And again, trying to understand those different stressors for particular students and how we can modify our courses. But again, asking the students, you know, to identify some of those stressors can be really beneficial. So again, these are just some ideas and suggestions, again, to discuss. But what we'd like to do next is ask the audience to share, either by unmuting or sharing in the chat, any ideas about ways that we can promote student wellness, either online or in our in-person classes. Anything that you've done or had success with, or have thoughts about doing.
Hi there. My name's Jana, and I was in the breakout group with some of you, but I'm calling from Canada. I'm at Memorial University of Newfoundland, and I teach mandatory professionalism and ethics classes for the entire cohorts of our engineering students. So I see everybody at one point. And one of the assignments that I do, so we do a lot of reflective work, and this year in 2 courses that I teach, I had a focus on resilience, and so there's lots of, you know, studies about resilience, and I'm a big fan of it. But I also have now realized that there's also problems with kind of putting the burden of resilience on people too. So I will put that as a caveat. But I have found, so I assigned everybody a resilience action plan of, like, pick something that that here are some factors of resilience, pick something, made some suggestions of stuff that might work for you, of something you can commit to, small or large, over the term, and report on it. And for some people, it causes them more stress, but I'm, trying to reward them with credit for reflecting on, okay, why is that causing you stress, and what do you need to do to adjust it? And for other people, they've actually said, like, the resilience action plan has helped them get through the term because they actually were forced to take time for themselves. So that's one way that I've been approaching it, through a framework of resilience.
Thank you.
One thing that I was able to do in class, in my statics and strength and materials class, we did a final lab, the stress lab. And so rather than actually talking about material stress, we said, is your personal stress, does that feel like compression or tension? And then for the actual lab activity, do something to relieve that stress for you and write about how it went. So for that class, it worked really well to kind of weave it into the topics, which was nice. And it was something that most of the students really enjoyed last semester.
A lot of great suggestions in the chat as well, about breathing exercises, and adding some additional Q&A time for students about other topics. I know my students, once last semester, I made a good news and pet pictures thread on the discussion board, and pretty much every student posted on it. And then my students this semester said, well, aren't you going to do that again? We need the pet pictures. So, again, giving them the time to have an opportunity to share about other things. Thank you, everyone, for these great suggestions.
All right, so we're going to move in and talk a little bit about engineers and help seeking. So this is a research area that I'm really passionate about. So I'm going to share kind of some of the data that we have that supports that engineers are significantly less likely to seek help for a mental health concern when compared to non-engineering students. And that's something that's concerning because we want to make sure that students that have a mental health concern are getting help so that it doesn't escalate, right? So this is data that we're looking at here, and we pulled out, so this is from data called the Healthy Minds Study, which is a national data set that was sent out to a bunch of different universities. There's like 40 or 50,000 college students that have filled out these surveys. And we did a comparison of those students within engineering to those from outside. And in this data, we just looked at those students that reported some symptoms of distress. So they had moderate or higher levels of anxiety or depression. And you can see engineering students are the light blue and non-engineering students are the dark blue. So about 45% of the engineering students that reported these symptoms of distress had actually sought help from a counselor or a therapist, as opposed to about 62% of the non-engineering students. So that's a pretty big gap between kind of that seeking help and that prevalence for seeking help when these students were under distress. And you might think that it's just because there's a high density of white males within the engineering student population, and white males are traditionally less likely to seek help as well. But if you break it down into different identities, you can see that this trend still persists, right? So looking at female students, which are slightly higher, more likely to seek help than just kind of the general student population, male identified students, first generation students, Black students, and Asian American students, you can see that the trend still persists. So even those populations that are less likely to seek help traditionally are also even less likely, if they're within an engineering major, to seek help for a mental health concern. So this is called a treatment gap. So when students have these symptoms and they're not getting help for it, it's called a treatment gap. And addressing this treatment gap can help to prevent that escalation of mental health disorders to something that is more chronic or more severe. So realistically, because of the role that we play in students' lives, faculty are often the first that our students are going to ask for help or to start kind of talking about the symptoms that they're experiencing. So another thing that we looked at is faculty experiences with mental health. And what I'm showing here is just the percent of faculty that have discussed specific topics related to mental health. So things like stress and anxiety, and the average number of students that they're talking to per year about these specific topics. So it's kind of like a frequency map where you can see these are high percentage of faculty are having more frequent discussions with students about things like stress and anxiety. So 80 to 90% of faculty are having conversations with students about things like stress and anxiety. About 75% of faculty have had conversations with students about depression. And you can see, even going down to suicidal thoughts and behavior, about 20% of engineering faculty have had talks with students about suicidal thoughts and behavior. So these conversations are happening. So it's really important for faculty to be prepared to have these conversations, because inevitably across your career, you're going to have a student approach you and talk to you about their mental health. So we also asked faculty how confident they were in discussing mental health with their students. And we had them talk about it with regards to each of those different types of mental health concerns. So you can see things like stress. Most faculty are moderately or extremely comfortable in talking with students about stress, right? That's also the most common thing that students are coming to talk to faculty about. But overall, there's really not a lot of kind of different topics that faculty are confident talking to students about. So stress and anxiety are at the top here, but you can see as we get down to depression and neurodevelopmental disorders, that there's a much lower level of faculty confidence in having these conversations with students. So that's something kind of more on the training side, and having sessions like this to talk about how do we actually navigate these conversations? What should we be saying when students approach us with these concerns? And how can we actually navigate those conversations? There's a lot of work that still needs to be done to make faculty more confident in having these conversations. So what we want to do again is put everyone into the breakout rooms that they were in before. And what we want to talk about in these breakout rooms is how can we encourage and support student help seeking, as well as where do we feel least prepared to support our students. So we'll take about 10 minutes to go into a breakout room and discuss this. Okay, I will go ahead and share my screen again and we can continue. All right, so now Melanie is one of our counseling psychology graduate students. So she's going to talk a little bit about identifying and talking to students who are in distress.
Hello, everyone. So I'm talking in really broad terms here, and I like to think of it as like, I'm going to do the black and white and y'all bring the color of you're the people who are seeing students, you are the people who know what this looks like every day. I'm talking from a broad mental health perspective, things to look for when someone might be experiencing a lot of depression or anxiety or adjustment concerns or mental health distress in general. The big piece of it is changes in behavior. So in order to notice changes in behavior, we have to be able to know what their baseline is, right? And that's tricky. And that's really tricky on Zoom too. So little pieces, especially in a classroom setting, of if people show up, if people are performing at a certain level, maybe you have a straight A student and something happened and they didn't hit the grades they normally hit, that's a marker something is changing. If they normally turn in homework and they're not turning in homework, those types of changes in performance are a little bit easier for us to see. Those are things that if you're looking for anything, you're looking for stuff like that, of like, oh, I normally have a student who comes and sits right up front and they haven't been here for 3 weeks. Those type of markers. Things like attendance and engagement, and this goes both directions. So if you normally have a student who comes and is really engaged or asks questions, and then they stop, that's a marker. And the other way around, if you have a student who normally sits in the back and minds their own business and all of a sudden they're a really, really big personality and talking a lot, that might feel really good, like, oh, they're engaging. But that type of radical behavioral change is something that it's a flag for us. It's not necessarily something there, but it's a flag, right? Any type of serious, notable marker of change. Also with socialization, things like if you notice that someone is usually engaged in chat discussion and they're not, or in class who they're sitting by, and then maybe now they're sitting by themselves, something like that, any sort of change in behavior. Another thing you can look for is any changes in clubs and organizations, especially now. I know my SCOL group talked about how hard it is for students to get connected to different clubs and organizations and just people in general. I know it blew my mind the other day. I was talking with an engineering student who is a sophomore, and I was like, how are you doing in COVID? And they said, well, I don't know any different. This is it. My whole college experience is online. So anytime that someone is not getting connected to campus, that's one of our biggest markers of retention too, not just retention, but also mental health, is belongingness and feeling connected to campus. So taking the time at the beginning or end of a class and asking people, oh, are people involved in this club, this organization? Have you heard of it? I sponsor it, or I was in it when I was an undergrad, or whatever that might look like. Those can be markers. Anytime someone is isolated, that's a flag for mental health. That's not how humans are wired to work for the most part. Insomnia. Now, I know y'all don't know how many hours a night your students are sleeping, and we'd probably be horrified. But if you have a student who is in Zoom, at least for me, this looks like my students who are literally laying in their bed. Like, I can see your pillow. I know you're in bed, right? Or in person, if you have someone who's falling asleep consistently in class, or looks really tired, or looks really low energy, that's something to look for, because insomnia and inability to sleep is linked specifically to chronic stress and anxiety. It's also conflated because there's a lot of work involved, but you don't know if you're not able to ask that question. Severe changes in weight or appearance, and again, this goes in any direction too. If you see someone rapidly losing or gaining weight, that's a pretty big marker that something might be going on mentally or in their environment. It's a hard conversation to have, and I probably wouldn't walk up to someone and say, hey, I see you lost a bunch of weight, or hey, I see you lost or gained a bunch of weight. But saying, hey, I've noticed some changes in your behavior, and I wonder if you wanted to come in and talk one-on-one and make sure you're getting the support you need. It feels a little different, right? Some of the big ones specifically for suicide and risk of someone ending their life by suicide are hopelessness, helplessness, isolation, burdensomeness, and uncharacteristically good mood. I'm going to break those down a little bit. Those are your big markers. Those are your big, we need to sit and talk to those student markers. So hopelessness in this context sounds like, I'm never going to get this. I don't even know why I'm trying. I think I should give up. I'm thinking about dropping out. You know, I don't even think it's worth doing the assignment at this point. Hopelessness. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. That is one of our classic markers of suicidality. Helplessness. Nothing is going to help. There's no point of going to my academic resource. I don't want to reach out to anyone. They kind of hang out together, hopelessness and helplessness, but they're a little bit different. Isolation. So if they're not talking to anyone, this is especially true of students right now, maybe who live alone, maybe who aren't on campus, maybe who don't have roommates even, or living with their parents or whoever their support system is. Lots of people live alone and stay alone in this context. My breakout group also had a conversation around, for whatever reason, more introverts tend to like go towards engineering and STEM fields, which is not an ugly word. I'm an introvert and proud of it, but introversion and isolation are not the same thing. And so making sure that people have someone in their support system, and if they don't, that's a marker for distress. Feeling like a burden. So if you do talk to a student, and this might look like them overly apologizing of, I'm so sorry, like I'm so embarrassed I'm asking you this question, you don't have to help, like I'll figure it out, don't worry about me, I don't want to bother anyone. That sense of being a burden for even being there, that's a huge marker specifically for suicidality. And then in a really change of pace, an uncharacteristically good mood. If someone has been down and kind of feeling hopeless and feeling a little blue, and then all of a sudden they come in and are very engaged and very over the top and maybe giving their possessions away or telling you what a great teacher you've been and how much they've enjoyed your class and they'll miss you, you need to not let that student leave your room until you had a conversation with them. That's actually like a huge marker for really high risk of completing suicide or attempting suicide. So that's a lot of information. Some of these other ones is feeling apathetic, that sense of I don't care about anything. I don't care if I fail. It's over. It goes kind of close to hopelessness and helplessness, but it's more of a mood of overall checked out, not coming to class, all of those pieces of it. And then making jokes. Lots of us, myself included, right? We make deflective jokes. We say things that aren't funny while we smile and laugh. We make a joke about like, oh, it'd just be easier if I quit. It would just be easier if I wasn't here. We say stuff like that. And when you are in the role of power as a professor, as an administrator, as someone who's working with and caring about students, we can't brush those jokes off, even though it's more comfortable to do that. So if you hear a joke, even in passing, about, oh yeah, like we're all miserable, we're all having mental health issues, all of us are awful, and I hear stuff like that all the time, right? Making sure to just check in and just say, hey, like I hear you, I just want you to know, like I see you, and if there's ever anything you want support on, I'm here. That little piece of reaching out can make a huge difference for people. I want to pause here for a second because I see some stuff going on in the chat and I can't multitask whatsoever. Yeah, lots of lots of people talk about struggling with sleep, right? And I think, you know, some of those pieces around mental health and modeling and talking about it to whatever degree you feel comfortable, because most people experience some form of mental distress at some point in your life. And most of us, I'm assuming here a little bit, have been through the undergraduate process in a similar field. And talking about like, I know when I was a student, I had a really hard time reaching out for help, or I had a really hard time pulling all-nighters, and modeling that piece of humanness from yourself. And look, you're still successful. And look, you're still in that job. You still have that degree. You still have those things. And normalizing the struggle and showing how you got help. So not just saying, yeah, we all do it. Like, suck it up. It happens to everyone. You want to take it from a lots of people feel this way, and here's what you can do to get support on it. So I really like anytime I see someone talking about how they have overcome something or gotten through something or still live with something and are still successful, that can be really powerful for people watching you in the room. Okay. So this next piece of it is talking about students who are in distress, because okay, once we identify something, at least for me, the scary part is saying something, right? Of like, okay, this student just told me that something is going on with them. I'm worried about this student. I don't know how to connect. In In general, I like the QPR model. It's pretty simple. Some of us are mandated to do this type of thing through our roles, but for those of us who aren't, and just as a refresher, Q stands for question. And remembering that asking someone about suicide is not going to plant the idea in their head. If they are not thinking about killing themselves, you saying, "Are you thinking about killing yourself?" is not going to make them. It's scary. I'm on the other side of that conversation all the time. It does not get less scary. And it's not about you in that moment. That discomfort is not the same as their potential lack of safety. So your comfort, their safety. We're going to prioritize their safety. And I want you to literally say the words, "Are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about hurting yourself?" Ask the big scary question, because sometimes that little pop is like a bubble and it releases all of that stress, and you'll see it physically on people's faces of, yeah, you know what, I'm really struggling right now. Ask the question, because we can guess and we can be smart about it and we can analyze it, but the only real way to know is to talk to someone. And part of that is individually, when you're talking to students one-on-one and maybe you're noticing some signs, asking them, "Are you thinking about hurting yourself?" And it's also in a group setting. It's on that syllabus day. Right up front, we start modeling. Include resources about mental health in your syllabus, and don't just slap them in there, because let's be honest, we all know these students do not read the syllabus with any level of depth, okay? It just doesn't happen, and they're not reading the resources. So saying the words of, you know, "I am here as your professor, I'm here to get you through this, and I know it's really hard, and I know it's really stressful, and I will try to do my best to connect with you individually, and it's difficult. And I want you to know that there are mental health resources here. And, you know, if you've ever gone to mental health and you feel comfortable saying that you've gone and sought help, this is the time to do it." If you want to talk about just as a group, like, how are your stress levels as they're coming into class, take a minute and breathe and stretch like we talked about, and ask people, "How are y'all doing this week? How are your other classes? How stressed are you?" And focusing on those open-ended questions where it kind of puts the burden on the other people to talk. Because if you give them a close-ended yes and no, they might nod their heads or like shake it. But for the most part, you're going to get glares, right? Like nothing. They're not going to talk to you because it's all Zoom. We're all on Zoom fatigue. But that piece of how, like, what is stressing you out? How can I be supportive of you? Those open-ended questions is really the start of how to talk to someone. It's just being curious and not being scared to say the big scary words. The next big part of it is persuading, so P. And a lot of that comes through role modeling. A lot of that we know from research, one of the things that is most likely to change our help-seeking behaviors are close peers and others. So people, especially people we respect. So if all of these students in your classes, or people, you know, maybe some of you aren't teachers, students you work with, are looking forward to these big careers in engineering, and you are an engineer, or you do have a big career in engineering, show them that it's okay to ask for support. Do it yourself, and then show them what that experience was like. You know, I talked to a professor who's in neuropsych, but you know, another STEM field, just a couple weeks ago, about how he made a point to call the counseling center and go through the initial consultation himself just to see what it was like. So he can tell a student, "You're going to call. This is exactly what's going to happen. You might be put on a wait list. You're going to talk to someone, like exactly what is about to happen. Lead by example." And this is no different. And it's actually a much more powerful position to see someone we want to be talking about this vulnerable thing is much more impactful than one of our peers or someone on the internet or something like that. So yeah, if you are acutely worried about someone, if we're talking about helplessness, hopelessness, burdensome, they're uncharacteristically happy, don't leave that person. Do it right now. Do it right now. Have that conversation for 30 seconds or 10 minutes. I will walk with you to the counseling center. Do you want me to stay on the phone? Do you want to fill out for Kentucky, it's called Community of Concern. I think they might have just changed their name. I don't know, but something like that. We'll do it together. I'll do it with you. Do it with them and do it right now. of connecting and kind of holding hands, you know, metaphorically, to get someone where they need to go, because it feels safer to go with someone who you know cares about you. And don't be scared to say that. If you care about your students, tell them you care about them. And I know that sounds corny and like a little hippy dippy of like, ooh, I care about you, but I do. And I'll tell you, at least half the time I tell my students I care about them, they cry. And it's because people don't tell people that just flat out of like, I care about you, and that is why I'm talking about this thing. And sometimes that's the biggest gift you can give someone. So be a little more vulnerable than you feel when you talk about this stuff, because you're asking for vulnerability for them to share with you their distress. And then refer. Know your free resources on campus. Campuses are pretty good about having free resources, but they're hidden. Sometimes a campus is like so big and has so many resources, it's a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose. Like there's a lot of information getting thrown at me. I get like 50 emails a day. I can't drink all of it. It's too much. So take a couple of minutes and shift through what resources exist, so that when you're in that moment and you have a student in front of you telling you something really big and scary, you don't have to simultaneously be like, well, do we have resources on campus? You already have that pre-planned of what those resources are and your ability to refer directly to where they might need to go. And then I say, if you have the time, like we all have so much free time, going through the steps yourself can be really powerful too, because you're able to understand in a whole new depth of what exactly you're asking your students to do. One thing that can feel really overwhelming is when we play like the resource game. We're like, oh, you need to go to the counseling center, and you need to go to behavioral health, and you need to go to the nutritionist, and you need to go to coaching, and you need to talk to your teacher, oh, and your advisor. And you're actually adding more things onto an already stressed out student. So to whatever ability you can kind of know what these resources are, you can help streamline some of that process. So I'll pause for a second again to look into the chat here. Yeah, absolutely. What Courtney said, I want to underline that. Just want and need an invitation, especially younger students, figuring out how to approach professors and people in power. Y'all, when I tell you half of my job is convincing people to talk to professors, and I see Courtney down here nodding her head too. I mean, like begging. I'm just like, listen to me. I'm a professor. I'm not scary. Like, go talk to your professors. They mostly care about you. And it goes both ways though. And I'm going to hold everyone in the room accountable. It goes both ways. It is scary for students to reach out to professors, and it is scary for professors to reach out to students, because it is vulnerable and it is weird and it is not modeled for us. And someone who has the power has to be the one to break that. And that's why we're all here. Y'all decided to be here from your own free will and want to learn about these things. And that's my challenge to you, is tell your students you care about them. And when it comes to it, say the big scary words. That is how you talk to a student in distress in an effective way. And it's okay to be scared while it happens. I'm scared every time, and I'm literally a counselor. Okay, that's the end of my section, I think, unless anything's going on in the chat, but I know Courtney's on top of that. Okay.
Thanks, Melanie. That was awesome. So we'll have a couple minutes. I'm just going to go through a summary, and then we'll have some discussion time. So just kind of summarizing what we've talked about. We've talked about some of the current research on mental health. And there's really a limited amount specifically on engineering student mental health, but there's a lot of researchers kind of emerging in that area to better understand kind of what is unique about engineering students and their experiences related to mental health. The frequency of mental health concerns is really university dependent, but national data tells us that engineering students are significantly less likely to seek help for a mental health concern. So we want to make sure that we're trying to model this. We're trying to encourage students to seek help if they are in distress. COVID-19 has significantly increased student stress levels, so especially with regards to depressive disorders, and it's also exacerbated equity and accessibility issues for students. So we want to be cognizant of that and make sure that we're designing our courses and accounting for those equity and accessibility issues when we're going through and teaching a class. It's important that we work to discuss and integrate mental wellness into the classroom. And faculty are frequently approached by students about mental health concerns. So we also want to be comfortable handling these conversations, thinking about and preparing ahead for what we want to say. We also want to work to recognize signs of distress so that we can approach students if we're concerned about them. And we don't have to do that in a scary way. We can just check in and ask how they're doing. And that can be enough to kind of get insight into how they're feeling. And we want to also make sure that we're comfortable knowing how to talk to students in distress. So just a list of some things that we can do that we've kind of talked about across the presentation. Advocate for increased resources. So anytime I get a chance to talk to higher administration, I talk about mental health resources on campus and just bring up the concerns. Engineers are less likely to seek help. The fact that if they go and try to seek help, if the counseling center says, oh, you're going to have a 3-week wait, that's going to make it even harder for them to get over that barrier, right? Because they're going to say, what's the point? I want help now. I don't want it in 3 weeks. Why am I going to do that? Right. And that increases the anxiety of then having to wait for an appointment for 3 weeks where they might be able to go and talk to someone right now. Just making sure you're increasing awareness for faculty, staff, and students. So just talking about mental health, I talk about it in faculty meetings. I talk about it with my students a lot. Talking about it starts to bring awareness to all the faculty, staff, and students, and also starts to normalize it. If you can, take advantage of training opportunities. So I've done mental health first aid, which is an 8-hour course that talks about kind of those signs of distress and how you can recognize those signs of distress, how you can respond to it, which is a really great thing. The QPR training that Melanie just talked about, question, persuade, refer, that's a shorter 1 or 2 hour course that you can learn about kind of how to recognize signs of suicidality and how to respond. Incorporate and normalize wellness in the classroom. Be aware of signs and stressors. So hopefully Melanie helped you out with that. Just knowing what to be looking for and how to react if you do see signs of distress. And just really be aware of campus and national resources that you can refer your students to. So if you're interested in keeping the conversation going, me and Andrew and Karen all have put together a Slack group for mental health and wellness in engineering. So we have a form here. If you want to just share your email, then you can go, we'll invite you to participate in that Slack group. Really, it's just a place for us to share resources, talk about problems or concerns that we might have, and get feedback from other faculty that are interested in, interested in talking about student mental health. So with that, I'm going to exit out of sharing my screen, and we can just kind of open the floor if anyone has anything that they want to talk about. We have about 10 minutes or 8 minutes or so for open discussion, questions that you might have that we haven't addressed at this point.
Do you have any, I don't know, recommendations for, so the situation where you have identified a student that's struggling, and maybe this is I teach in a relatively small program, so it's not like I have students for a semester, I have them for a couple years. And it doesn't matter how many recommendations you make, they're just resistant to seeking help at all. I don't know. I would take any suggestions.
So I've done the referrals before where you refer them to another resource on campus that will reach out to them. But again, I think that it's fairly easy to avoid. I would just have the conversation and just plan on checking in with that student a little bit more regularly, just to make sure if they're kind of at a baseline, make sure that baseline doesn't change. Even if that baseline isn't perfectly mentally well, at least you can check in to make sure that it's not changing. Courtney or Melanie, I don't know if you have any better thoughts on that.
I know one thing that I do, I try to reframe away from the word help. I know that's what I've been saying a lot today because we literally call it help seeking in the literature. But I try to reframe it in the college setting because it's a little bit different. So I use the metaphor all the time of if you were in the store and you were hungry and you bought an apple, you wouldn't feel like you were asking for help and begging from that store. When you go into college and you pay for your college tuition, we call it free, but it's really included. And those things are different. So you're really taking what you have already bought. And so I try to reframe it, and you'd be surprised how helpful that really can be in terms of this is a support that exists for you because people know that this is a uniquely stressful environment. And so trying to shift where some of that resistance and stigma comes from, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times it comes from this sense of help. Like, I don't need someone to reach a hand down to me and help me. And reframing it into support that you have literally already paid for can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think reframing is really important. And I think it goes back to some of the markers that Melanie was mentioning earlier. For example, like a lot of students who feel like a burden, they feel like asking for help kind of reinforces that. And so I think just letting them, like, kind of normalizing help seeking, and also just talking, like framing it as everyone needs support at different points in their time. Seeking help doesn't look one particular way. And I think there's oftentimes a fear of talking to a therapist because it confirms something about who you are. That is probably something that 9 out of 10 people want to avoid. And so letting them know there are other options besides that one that has the stigma attached to it. Getting help or support could literally be talking with a peer, like a student who is a coach. Like, I don't know if this school has them, but my old institution had peer health coaches. And so talking with another student who's had some training about how to have better sleep practices, things like that. You figure out what is actually causing them stress. Is it that they're not eating? Is it that they're not getting sleep? And then you can make more specific recommendations that hopefully feel less, like someone mentioned, feels less like you're sending them away and feels tailored to their actual need.
I have a question for anyone. One thing I saw as an undergrad that I don't know how to combat this environment was kind of like a one-downmanship, kind of like, I stayed up till 2 a.m. to work on this. I stayed up till 3 a.m. Well, we all failed, but we failed less than the other people, so we're doing okay. Because that's not necessarily good mental health wise. And I don't know if anybody has any tips on that.
So I just try to talk to students about the fact that that's not normal, and have them kind of thinking about mental wellness regularly, and check in with them on that. So I try to, encourage students to be, if they're working in a homework group, kind of making sure that they're respectful of time restraints and respectful of deadlines so that they're not in those positions. And really, a lot of it is just breaking it down, where some faculty kind of think that that's the game that you play in engineering, and you say, oh, we all go through this and you're going to go through this, I went through this. And we don't want to encourage that. So making sure that you're kind of breaking down that narrative and explain, like, sure, you may think that in engineering this is the norm, but in reality those things aren't healthy, and this is what you can be doing instead. I've worked with students on how to create a calendar to try to make themselves more structured schedules so that they're getting their work done in a normal amount of time and not procrastinating and ending up in those conditions. So in addition to saying, hey, that's not normal, that's not healthy, but also here's some strategies to prevent that from happening so that you can spread out that big assignment over time rather than having it all kind of sneak up on you at the end.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that'll help on some things, but I've also seen it as kind of a competition. As some of you may have, and so I don't. It's partly the personalities, especially when I was an undergrad. I was in aerospace, and we had a lot of test pilot type personalities, and the more you could take, the better you were, basically. So I guess just combating that, like, kind of unhealthy environment.
For me, and I don't know if this is good or not, but if I hear my students say something like this, I let them know that I could not take that. And, maybe my hope is that it gives them permission, like, oh, I can't stay up past 11. Maybe it gives them permission to, or gives them the perspective to see this isn't an integral part of engineering.
Sorry, I was trying to type this whole elaborate thing in the chat, so I'll just say it out loud. I want to just say that like it's admittedly hard to create new norms. Like norms don't happen overnight. And so far, you know, thinking about the interviews I've done with engineering students, I would say at least half of them feel like there is a competitive environment. And so that's not going to just change overnight. But I do think that people involved with engineering students can take small steps to start normalizing other things and prioritizing other things. And so instead of rewarding certain behaviors, just encouraging other ones. And so, you know, letting students know that, you know, good work is good work. And it doesn't matter if you stayed up to 3 a.m. or if you went to bed at 9 p.m. I'm evaluating, you know, this other thing. I'm not evaluating how much you tortured yourself. And I actually would prefer you all to care for yourself. And that's the best way to get things done, because over time, if you're just constantly stressed, overwhelmed, you know, your work is probably going to reflect that. And so I would say, you know, just the language and being careful of what we are encouraging, even in subtle ways, can be important.
Yeah, and I just want to underline and like emphasize everything Courtney said. And I think, and you know, I wasn't in engineering, but I'm a very let me get the 100, not just an A kind of person. It's something I've been with my whole life and I'm working on, and that's true of a lot of engineering students too. And I think to expand Courtney's point of like some of the unwritten things we do too, like putting an email block after 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock and say like, for self-care, life balance reasons, I will not be responding to emails. Or setting that time, that due time at 5 o'clock instead of at midnight or at 8 a.m. Like I know we referenced that a little bit, but to bring it home, that is implicit modeling of what we're expecting of students and how late we're expecting you to be staying up.
All right, so just to be respectful of our time, it is 3:30 now. So we will wrap things up. If you want to continue the conversation, I will post again the link to sign up for our Slack. So if you go to this Google form, put your email in, then we'll send you a link to be able to join our Slack group. But thank you for participating and being active in the conversation today. Hopefully it was helpful for you.
Thank you for this great workshop. So Sarah just posted the link to the Slack sign up, and I just posted the post-workshop survey. So if you could do that, it's 5 required multiple choice questions and 4 optional short answers. So not too long. We would greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much.